Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. So I'm going to talk a little bit before we get into kind of the neat stuff that you really want to hear about. I'm going to talk about some basic research that we've done through the Regional Education Laboratory Midwest that grew out of a project we were working on for the state of Minnesota, where they really wanted to look at different ways to identify schools that actually, quote unquote, turned around. The idea that they had was they were looking for exemplars. And so the first step, obviously, is to identify schools that meet some criteria for having, quote unquote, turned around. So the focus of this presentation is really kind of looking at some of the basic criteria that have been used, and then go through an example of the project that we used in Minnesota, some different criteria that we used to identify schools that had actually, quote unquote, turned around, which then would lead into what do you do with those schools, or how do you make changes in those schools? So obviously the issue of school turnaround has been a lead topic in national discussions about education. I'm going to try to stand. Some technology issues. Sorry. It's not the. Okay. So all right. So educators have emphasized the need to drastically increase student achievement in the nation's most chronically low-performing schools, and several competitive federal grants, including Race to the Top and obviously school improvement grants, require that participants demonstrate the capacity to effectively implement a federally defined turnaround model in return for funds to turn around low-performing schools. A recent review of the turnaround-related literature identified numerous internal and external factors that seem to contribute heavily to school failure, which factors including things such as weak district and/or state support, poor teacher quality, limited resources, student and community poverty, and students lacking prerequisite skills. However, many of these same factors appear in schools that probably would not be characterized as failing, and occasionally appear in schools that would be characterized as being successful. In other words, the documentation of characteristics typically noticeable in schools in need of turnaround does not necessarily indicate a school is failing. The know one when you see one approach is not scientific and lacks the rigorous identification necessary when considering ramifications on resource allocation, personnel decisions, and school sanctions. Yep. Okay. Oh, is it? Is it too loud?
No, it's not too loud. I can barely hear it back there. I don't know if it's just the feed or what.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay.
I'm trying to roll
And
and
now it's going okay. So now I have to stand over here. Is that better? It's always the first one. I'm the guinea pig. So.
People next door said they were really enjoying it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So we can go back over here. Okay. Although research and policy work continues to develop mechanisms that will potentially lead schools to turn around their academic performance, the identification of schools that are in need of turnaround and schools that have actually achieved turnaround remains inconsistent across the educational landscape. SIG awards provide states with parameters for identifying the lowest achieving schools, but states have considerable latitude in how schools are actually identified. What constitutes successful turnaround appears even less defined. Perhaps the most recognized effort to streamline the turnaround discussion exists in the form of the federally funded IES practice guide called Turning Around Chronically Low-Performing Schools, which draws on several case studies of schools that have successfully, quote-unquote, turned around. However, the author of the guides acknowledged that their findings are based on weak evidence, in this case meaning a reliance on case studies rather than experimental or quasi-experimental designs. In addition, a review of the case studies reported in that guide also highlights another substantial limitation in that there was no consistent measure used to determine when a school has turned around or even when the schools are in need of turnaround. There is agreement, however, that turnarounds by definition occur quickly. There appears to be an element of urgency to identify turnaround schools, but little discussion has been provided regarding the decision-making processes used to define the necessary steps. Thus, in the section that follows, I'll describe a procedure that can be applied using easily attainable school-level data to to identify schools that have quote-unquote turned around or made substantial improvement in school-wide academic performance in a short period of time. And I will demonstrate the procedure using publicly available data from Minnesota. As an aside, school-level scores and state averages often are reported by subject area and grade level, and education stakeholders attempting to make quick dichotomous judgment of better or worse than average face a more complex task when trying to summarize performance of an entire school across grades and subject areas. The use of student proficiency rates, as opposed to scale scores, as an indicator of school performance has its advantages and limitations. As a one-time indicator of degree to which students within a school are acquiring academic skills and knowledge expected given their grade level, at a particular point in time, at least according to the standards established by the states, proficiency rates have an intuitive appeal. Proficiency rates are easy to understand, are not dependent on technical information related to raw test scores, and are provided by SEAs for all schools. However, research has demonstrated proficiency rates may not be a suitable indicator for broader comparisons, such as comparisons across time or across subjects, because this indicator is affected by influences unrelated to student performance, such as the choice of cut point for determining proficiency. The model I'm going to talk about uses student scores as a basis for comparison. Discussions of the advantages and limitations of this approach will follow the discussion of the model and an example of this approach. Again, the starting point for this attempt to define substantial improvement schools was the screening criteria used by panelists who developed the U.S. Department of Education's Turning Around Chronically Low-Performing Schools, which uses the two following criteria to identify schools. The first is that schools had a high proportion of students failing to meet state standards for proficiency or mathematics and reading for at least 2 years in a row. The second is that schools displayed substantial gains in student achievement in a short amount of time, that is, no more than 3 years, either by increasing the number of students who met proficiency standards by at least 10% or by showing similar large improvements in other measures of academic performance. However, few examples exist of studies that develop a clear set of procedures for this task and apply those procedures to identify such school. Although the above definition offers a more precise set of criteria, it still lacks specificity. Moreover, the criteria do not address the issues of school-level aggregation or how to combine multiple scores within a given school based on different subjects, grades, and the reliance on proficiency scores. All right. So therefore, an expanded set of criteria can be used. In addition to incorporating school-level standardized achievement averages rather than percent proficient and factor scores as a preferred indicator of school-wide performance, we use 4 other criteria for schools to be labeled substantial improvement schools. The first is examination of school-wide year-to-year changes must show a persistent non-negative trends. That is, it's non-isolating, steadily increasing, or holding steady. Second, for the various grade levels and subjects tested within a school, there must be a general consistency of increasing performance for year-to-year trends. Third, for the final year of data being examined, school-level averages must no longer fall within the poor performance range compared to other schools. And fourth, school substantial improvement cannot be accompanied with a major change in student demographics. The non-oscillating data pattern criterion is intended to guard against misclassifying schools whose school performance is oscillating rather than steadily improving. An example of such an oscillating pattern is provided here. Substantial and consistent year-to-year increases in reading are demonstrated for this school because scores show the steady increase that surpasses the benchmark for improvement. Scores for mathematics, however, show a different pattern. Although the math mean scale scores show a net increase of, let's say, a quarter standard deviation looking from 2006 to 2009, the pattern of scores over years shows an oscillating pattern. And so, or in other words, shows a pattern of year-to-year increases and decreases in performance rather than steadily increasing. According to this criterion, the school in this figure would not be classified as showing substantial improvement from 2006 to 2009. The consistency of increase among the majority of grade levels and subject criterion is intended to ensure that the improvements demonstrated through changes among school-level factor scores are apparent for all the grade levels and subjects. That is, the component data or school-level means for various grade levels and subjects must reflect the general trend found among the composite findings. That is, the findings using scores between 2006 and 2009. The third criterion is intended to include only those schools whose averages over this period of time are no longer within the bottom tier of schools. Implied within the definition of substantial improvement used here is that the schools are indeed improved. Figure 2 depicts a data pattern of a school that shows substantial increases, but the school still needs to achieve greater gains in performance before they can be classified as showing substantial improvement. This need for additional improvement is exemplified by the high school in Figure 2, whose graduation rate remains below 20%. And finally, the purpose of the fourth criterion, ruling out schools that experience major demographic shifts, is to rule out changes in the makeup of the student population within a school as possibly contributing to the improvement in scores. Analysts must be confident that the substantial improvement in school performance is due to improvements in organization, curriculum, instruction, and learning within schools rather than demographic shifts among the population served by the school over the years being examined. For example, a school that experiences a sudden decrease in the population of students eligible for free or reduced price lunch would be experiencing a demographic shift that does not speak to better instruction, leadership, and so on within the school. The operationalization of these expanded criteria take the form of decision rules. One potential set of rules with the performance benchmarks shown in Table 1 and Figure 3 in your handout. And I just want to note, on your table, there's a separate handout that has some of these figures as well as some additional information. So when I'm referring to the handout, that's what I'm referring to. I don't think there was enough for everybody at the table, but there's a couple there if you get a chance to look at it. Okay. So in this example, for schools to be identified as demonstrating substantial improvement, they have had to have school performance factor scores from 2006 in the lowest 25% for their school type. These schools would also have to have factor scores in the lowest 25% for 2004 and or 2005. Schools meeting these two criteria would demonstrate not only that they were low performing in 2006, but also that their poor performance was chronic or spanning several years. Continuing with this example, to be considered substantial improvement schools, these chronically low performing schools would need to have demonstrated the required increases in school performance over the period of time. These increases could be determined by calculating the change in scores between 2006 and 2009 for each subject and grade level. These change indices then could be averaged for all subjects and grade levels, and schools with averages greater than or equal to a quarter standard deviation would be judged to meet this criterion. Despite this benchmark, however, it remains possible for schools to meet the benchmark while still having decreasing trends in some subjects and grade levels. To account for this possibility, the next criterion involved examining the year-to-year changes in school performance between 2006 and 2009 for each subject and grade level. To be labeled a substantial improvement school, schools' test data would have to show non-negative changes for most, for example, 75% of the year-to-year changes for various grade levels and subjects. Slight decreases between successive years, for example, within the range established by standard errors for each year, would be considered holding steady, while decreases greater than that amount would be considered true increases. Implied in this criterion for substantial improvement is the idea that such schools are no longer low performing, that is, they have actually quote-unquote turned around. Schools whose 2009 performance factor scores remain within the bottom 25 percentile would not be considered as having made a substantial improvement. And again, the final criterion obviously involves ruling out the possibility that improvements in school-wide achievement data reflect demographic shifts that may be occurring within the population served by the school rather than additional academic press placed on a consistent student population. Tests of the relationship between the year and the demographic characteristics of interest can be performed to test this criterion. So, for our example, to put this in kind of real terms, we use publicly available school-level data obtained from the Minnesota Department of Education website. The data for these analyses were comprised of school-level results on the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment Series 2, or MCA2, which is Minnesota's standardized-based high-stakes test administered to school children in grades 3 through 8, 10, and 11 in reading and math. For high schools, we also use four-year graduation rates, even though these graduation rates were not yet published for 2009. So we started with a pool of 1,381 public open enrollment schools in Minnesota that had school-level data available between 2004 and 2009. It should be noted that the Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment was changed between 2005 and 2006. For the analysis that we used here, the use of the data from the original version of the MCA was okay because we were just looking for consistent low performance across multiple years when we started in 2006. So the ongoing use of the MCA2 as a state assessment over the years 2006-2008 made it possible for analysts to create school composites using the average MCA2 scores for students in each grade level and subject, to determine which schools were low performing in the years 2004, 2005, and 2006, to identify which schools were chronically poor performing, and made average gains equivalent to a quarter standard deviation across 3 subsequent years, and to verify these schools by making consistent non-negative progressions year to year. So it looks like my time's up already. So one thing which actually I think is fairly interesting, if you look on the handout that has the tables on it, you can actually see from the pool of 1,300 schools using these criteria, we really wound up identifying 7 schools across the whole state who would meet these criteria. And I think that one thing to kind of keep in mind is that this was done based on a need that was defined by the state of Minnesota, and so the criteria that we selected were based on their particular needs. It does not mean you have to use these particular criteria. It doesn't mean these are the right or wrong ones. It means this was a dialogue we had based on the political climate and the kinds of things that were going on in Minnesota. The bigger issue really is when we're talking about research on turning around low-performing schools, and we're talking about consequences that are going to be put in place for defining these schools, it's really important to have clear criteria to be used and to really be confident in your determination that a school is A, really low-performing, and B, that a school has actually turned around. Because what tends to happen is those schools are defined or seen as exemplars, and then everybody's going to come in and try to figure out what they're doing. So to have a really confident understanding and a confident decision that those schools have actually turned around is really, really important. And this is just kind of an example of one way to do that that may be relevant and help to make a better decision or clear understanding of what it means to, or what some evidence that the school has actually turned around. So, thanks.
You can see that there's a lot of information to try and cram into a very, very tight and short timeline. We'll give you a little bit of time at the end to be able to talk about your table and ask particular questions. I want to introduce Sam Reddick. Sam is the director for the Center on Innovation Improvement. He served as an expert panelist for IES on school turnarounds, and he's a former high school teacher and coach. So he's lived the life that you all are as well.
Would you say I've lived large, or you said I'd live the life? Okay, all right. I want to make sure I got that. Thank you, Don. Is my time started? Okay, go. How many of you remember the word restructuring? Oh, it's still around, isn't it? Remember back about 2005, 2006, most states were starting to get schools marching up up or down, whichever way you want to look at it, the non-AYP path, and they were hitting restructuring. And then the Center for Education Policy started coming out with these studies of what's happening in these restructuring schools. And I think of the first 5,000 or some schools that went through, what they concluded was that 96% of the time the districts chose the mild other remedy, and there was very little evidence that any were really getting significantly better. So now go back to about 2007 as all of this was becoming apparent, and there were a lot of people saying, so what does it really take to get dramatic improvement in a school that has been chronically low performing? So the Institute for Education, or of Education, I can always get those mixed up. Institute for Education Sciences. Libby, which is it? Okay, whatever. IES decided to take a look at school turnarounds, and so they formed a panel of some of us that were, some on the panel were researchers, some were, there's actually one principal who had accomplished a turnaround. So there were practitioners, and some of us were kind of those people in between. And we, in 2007-08, did a review of whatever research we could find on turnaround, and there was slim picking, so there was very little out there. As you can see from what Matt just described, first of all, just to find a school that turned around, it's like finding a needle in a haystack, and then to find one that turned around that somebody studied is even less likely. And back then, the only studies were case studies, which tend to be retrospective, somebody looking back and saying it turned around and wonder how they did it, which is not a very scientific design. So we didn't have to have much to go on, but that didn't keep us from forging ahead. And so, holy cow, I must have is that the next one? I think it's okay anyway. There we go. Thank you. Did I hit this? I must have. Okay. So what I'm going to quickly do in my remaining 12 minutes and 14 seconds is to give you the conclusions of that year of study on turnarounds by IES, which were published in a document you've probably all seen. It's called Turning Around Chronically Low-Performing Schools. It's available on everybody's website. Came out in 2008. We also presented it on Capitol Hill for congressional staff and that type of thing. What you will not be surprised to find are the conclusions. Where turnarounds occurred, we thought we could, sorry, Matt, we thought we could boil it down to about 4 things that seemed to happen. And I'm not going to go into depth on these. I'm just going to kind of throw them out to stir your thought about them. Number 1, at some point in time, this school and the people around it, that community, came to some new recognition, this catalytic moment that said things really got to change. And there was a signaling of that change to everyone. In 70% of the instances, that meant new leadership. A new principal was on board. We found the same thing in the cross-sector analysis when you look at turnarounds in business. About 70% of the time it means there's a new sheriff in town. And just having that new leader at the top is one way to signal change, but this went far beyond that. This was really some way that school boards, faculties, parents, everybody were getting the notion that this time we really mean it, no more business as usual, things have changed. So there's that signaling of change, and that typically came from the leadership and often meant new leadership. Okay, I'm going to skip number 2, go quickly to 3, which says there were visible improvements early, and these are words you are all familiar with now, quick wins. Because what happened was in these schools, think about the psychology of the people in these schools. These are typically places that have tried 100 things to get better and been very frustrated. And it had gone on year after year. And so you get a real tendency of people to kind of have moral fatigue or whatever you might want to call it. They are to the point where they think nothing can really get better here. We've seen it all before. All right? Well, when you have just announced no more business as usual, things are really different, we're going in a new direction, you'd better show evidence of that early, or people will say, see what we mean, and they'll drift away from you. So just for that kind of psychological reason of convincing people that change could happen and would happen, we found that these leaders, these typically principals, looked very early and looked at what they thought they could change that would matter to people within that first few months and at least within that first year. And often these were physical changes. I mean, clean the place up and make it look bright. Often it was had to do with student behavior. And so some of these principals said, hall passing time seems to be everyone's complaint. Fine, all adults in the hallways during passing time. And there was a noticeable difference and a calm in the school. Sometimes it was looking, and teachers had a real complaint about their schedules. They simply were not given time for collaborative planning and schedule, and the principals changed schedules. And the teacher said, wow, we've been asking for that for years. We finally got it. So whenever something could happen early that showed people that change was going to happen, that was a quick win. 4, build, provide a committed staff. We had a big argument over the word committed because some of us wanted to put in the word competent as well. But what it really means is, first, you've got to have people that have the skill sets you need. They've got to be competent in what you need. If you have 5 reading specialists and 1 math specialist, but your kid's scores in math are low, you might have to trade out good people just to get the right skill sets. So skill and competence is one thing, but this is saying also, you can't have people that it's going to take you years to convince that they ought to get on board. You need people on board now. That's the committed part. So they're not only competent, but they're committed to this new direction. And and that they have the skill sets you need. Okay, the reason I saved number 2 until last is because 1, 3, and 4 are only stage setters. Those are the things you do so that you can get dramatic instructional improvement. 1, 3, and 4, none of those in itself will cause this dramatic change. So you do those just to set the stage. What causes the change in learning outcomes is what happens in a classroom. So number 2 was the one what we thought was the most significant, but 1, 3, and 4 seemed to need to be in place first. This whole idea about signaling change, and I'll hit this one quickly. We've analyzed this a little bit more since that time, and what tends to happen is that community of people around that school somehow face what we call the brutal facts. And no, this doesn't just mean showing them test scores to show that their test scores stink or their graduation rate is low. What it really means is to help people in a very personal way understand what that means for kids. And so what we found was very effective is when this community people could say, well, what happens to our kids when they're 30 years old or 40 years old? And we know what happens to kids that come out of schools with very low graduation rates, with very, very poor test scores. We've got statistics on that. And so if you talk about it in those terms and to people and say, these are your children, these are your students, here's what's likely to happen in kids' lives when they are prepared this way by their schools. That's the brutal facts, but those are very personal facts to people and make them more willing to commit to the necessary change. Facing those facts seemed to be essential first, but the second step was to not leave them there, but to say it doesn't have to be this way. There are schools that have exactly our demographics that are doing a much better job. Here's a vision of what we can do. That's still not enough. Third thing is you give them some kind of practical pathway to get there. So that what we found was effective was when leadership was able to, one, make people really come to a gut-level personal confrontation with what happens to kids that come out of schools like this. Second, see that it can be better because other schools are doing it. And third, see, so there's some step-by-step way to get there. You don't have to have all the steps, but they got to see some practical pathway so they know what you do first. Did I do that? Well, I tell you, this thing is automatic. I think it's responding to my brain waves. Now back up. I think I missed one. Did I? No, I didn't. Go ahead. All right. Now the last topic I wanted to hit on quickly is leadership for change. You know, and all this SIG. I mean, it's some of the models. You're changing everything. I mean, you're closing a school and starting a new one. Even in transformation, you're expected in most cases to bring in new leadership. A lot of you are leaders for change in some aspect of SIG, whether you're at a state level, a district level, an external partner, wherever you are, you're part of this leadership for change. And so when you're looking for a leader for change, who are you going to call? Barney Fife? I don't know. Aunt B? My wife votes for Aunt B. She said she thinks Aunt B would be right there shaking her finger at you until you got it right. Not sure who the third one is. She reminds me of a neighbor when I was a kid that would always run and tell things to my mom, doesn't she? Anyway, the point is you can't always go by outward signs, and as we've come to meet a lot of successful turnaround change leaders, they are not always Big Joe Clark with the baseball bat from the movie, what was that, Lean on Me? They don't necessarily have that big charisma. What they have is a very firm will, a commitment to keep putting one step in front of the other, and the ability to get all the people behind them. So, what do we know about leadership for change? Well, what we know there I'm going to skip because I'm running out of time. You've got it in your handout. It's just a little model of what to look for in a leader. Here's what we actually found when we look into the question, so what is it leaders do in a turnaround situation? Not who they are or what background they have, but what do they do? Here's what we found. One was they did a very good job of initial analysis and problem solving. Real quickly, what this means is they weren't people that came to town thinking they already had the answers. They were people that arrived at the school and absorbed every bit of information they could. I mean, these people went down and sat down with the cooks in the cafeteria. They pored over teachers' schedules. They knew the background of every teacher. They knew the kids before they jumped to conclusions. So there's a great personal immersion in data broadly defined. And then they started to come up with a plan for what needed to be done and engage people in it. Whoa.
Can you go back to real quick to this, because it's very hard to read on here. Just so to see what the goals are.
They're on the next slide. It's the same thing on the next slide. But let me get through this, and then we can pick that up later.
I figured you got it.
Okay, what happened here? It's like it. Showing now some problems. Okay, go the other, or let me do it. Okay. That one should have been before. All right, whatever. The other thing that we found these leaders did was that there's a relentless sense of driving for results. This doesn't surprise you, does it? They kept a real focus. And a lot of this is where the instructional part came in. They really knew what happened in classroom. I'll point out one here that was really important. It's the third one. It says require all staff to change. There was none of this trying to convince people to get on board. There was everybody's on board now. There was no piloting of things. There was no let's get a few teachers to try it and see if it works. There was here's the way we're going. Everybody's going with us. That's very different than a lot of what we tried in comprehensive school reform. And that's one of the reasons comprehensive school reform had trouble, because we thought you could take 3-star teachers and they would implement, and everybody else would say, boy, that's great, I want to do it too. What happened is those 3, we worked them to death. They got tagged as the principal's pets. They burned themselves out, and the other people never did get on board. So this says everybody's on board from day one. These leaders were great at influencing people inside and outside the organization. This meant they could go to the superintendent and get what they needed for their school, even if it was not what was typical district policy. They could sit down with the right leaders in the community and get them on board when they might have people starting already to complain about change. These were people that knew how to have coffee with the right people at the right time for the right reasons. So they influenced inside and outside the organization to get what they needed for their school. There was constant kind of measuring and reporting of things. There's a great transparency. There are places where they have not only data walls, but they have big open-air meetings where parents and everybody comes and they put it all out there, what's working, what isn't, and they were able to transform the culture to one of what we call a culture of candor, where people could talk openly about what was working, what wasn't, and make changes without becoming personal, without finger pointing, without defensiveness. The data was not just keep dragging people over kids' outcomes, that was part of it, but have data on what people are doing that are producing those outcomes. What instructional strategies are being used, what curriculum is being covered, what kids are in what programs. So there was a look at, they had good data and measurement of what the adults were doing as well as what the kids were learning. Thank you. And lastly, I think particularly on the one about instructional change, what these principals did that seemed to work was they put a great emphasis on highly effective, highly functioning teacher instructional teams. Whether these were grade level teams or subject area teams, these were groups of teachers that had not just the time to do instructional planning together, to look at student data, but also to look at the materials they used, the strategies they used, to differentiate instruction. They not only had the time for that, but they had the expectation for work products. They had a system to work within. They were highly effective, highly functioning teacher teams, and that seemed to be the kind of nexus point of what happened within a school when a turnaround was achieved. We've got all kinds of materials on both SIG and turnaround at that Center II website, which is on your handout also, so I'd invite you to go there. And I think this afternoon they're going to put out stacks of materials also. Thank you.
So we keep moving along. We've been trying to, in some ways, narrow the funnel. Matt gave us a picture of how you define turnaround in this one particular example of a research study. And Sam was leading us to what are those leader actions that help you get to that end. And now Yael Kidron is going to tell us about the Doing What Works resource that helps you narrow things down further to specific practices.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon. Good morning. Whoa. Better? Okay. All right. 4 years ago, I had the pleasure of being the deputy project director of the Waters Clearinghouse at the time that the IES School Turnaround Practice Guide was created. And at the same time, I was part of the management team of the Doing What Works initiative that was newly launched by the U.S. Department of Education by OPEPD. And the DWW website was tasked with the translation of the IES practice guide into available resources and tools for administrators and educators. And that's the focus of my presentation today. Doing What Works has two main goals: to make it easy to find research-based practices and to provide practical tools that are aligned with those research-based practices. Now, I would like to point out that there are many relevant topics on the Doing What Works website, including adolescent literacy, encouraging girls in math and science, data-driven instructional decision-making, foundations for algebra. You will find a lot of relevant resources on the website, but I'm going to focus today on the school turnaround topic and its translation into content, and I will briefly describe the structure of the website. There are two main purposes of use of the website. One is for professional development by professional development providers, and planning and evaluation by school, district, and state staff. And I'm going to start with professional development. There are many different ways in which you may want to look for resources that are relevant to what you do. For example, if you're interested in distributed leadership, you may go and put in a keyword in a search bar and see what comes up. We recommend a different approach. We recommend a cycle that has 3 parts to it. The first part starts with the research evidence and the key concepts. For that purpose, we provide on the website information about the level of evidence. So as Sam noted, it has been rated by the expert panel as low because there are no experimental or quasi-experimental design studies that study school turnaround. However, it is very interesting to read those case studies. Some of them are written from the voice of the principal or the specialist that has done the turnaround. And we provide links to either the abstracts or the full copies that are available on the internet. And multimedia overviews, for example, that are available on the practice level, that's a really great way during professional development time to energize and to motivate the staff to focus on the practice and to think about the goals in mind. We have expert interviews, and we have different experts featured on different teams, including Dr. Sam Redding. And in addition to description of the practices, the multimedia overviews, the research evidence, links to related websites, you also have a visual diagram. So you have the visual diagram in the form of a postcard in front of you for school turnaround, and we have created it for each one of them. Again, the idea is to energize and to motivate your staff to think about the practices. After they have learned the research, The second part of the professional development process is to look at examples from schools and districts. Now, nothing is more powerful and more convincing than seeing others that have really done it and were successful in applying those practices. Now, I would like to make a conceptual distinction between a practice and a strategy or a tactic. A practice is the recommendation that came out of the research, like quick wins or focus on instruction. There are many different ways to implement a practice. Now, what may be found on the website is examples of schools that have done their own way. It worked for them. But these are not the only ways to do it. And certainly we could not provide an exhaustive list of all the ways to implement the practice. And it would be an unrealistic expectation. So it would be very good to eliminate this expectation to avoid frustration in the future. What is good to keep in mind that knowing the research evidence, knowing the key concept of a practice, empowers teachers to look critically at the resources that they find on the internet. We are not supposed to be the only place on the internet for them to look at resources. We would like teachers to feel empowered to go and surf the internet and look for information, but we would like them to screen it critically and think, does it make sense? Is it aligned with what experts recommend? Here is an example of one of the high schools that we featured under the school turnaround topics. It's Waterford High School, a rural school in Waterford Unified School District. Nearly half of the students are Hispanic. Nearly half of the students are eligible for free reduced lunch program. About 1 in 10 students is special education or English language learner or both. When the school, a local newspaper described the school as the bottom of the barrel in 2003. And not for nothing, 6% of the students in the school were proficient in Algebra 1, and 28% were proficient in English language arts. In 2008, 72% of the students were proficient or advanced in Algebra 1, and 49% were in ELA. Now, the difference in ELA looks smaller, so I will add one small detail. None of the students in 2003, that's the blue graph, were advanced. All of them were proficient. But half of those 49% students in 2008 were advanced. So it's actually a remarkable progress. Now, how did they do it? Their own strategy began with independent observers who came into the school from the county office, and they have administered an instructional time survey. So they went into each and every classroom, and they counted minutes, and they found out that only about half of the class time was spent on instruction, and the rest of the time was spent on other activities. Now, that sparked a whole lot of conversation. The school principal had to rethink organizational practices in the school, for example, the timing of announcements and assemblies and other stuff. In addition, the school principal has consulted with all key stakeholders, teachers, coaches, department chairs, parents, community members. And he synthesized the data and came up with instructional norms. For example, communicate clear objectives. The student needs to know what's the purpose of the lesson. Or check for understanding. Check for understanding means calling on non-volunteers. For example, every teacher had popsicle sticks, and they wrote names of students on those popsicle sticks. And they randomly pulled a popsicle stick and they called on a student. And if the student did not know the answer, guess what? They came back a second time and a third time. No one was off the hook. So what I have in the photos here are samples of the media. You can watch all of those stuff, all those videos on the website. And one of the interesting way that the school, as a school-wide approach, has implemented it was a monthly whole staff professional development meeting. And all the teachers, math, PE, arts, English, physics, they all came together and they studied each time a different instructional norms. And then they sat in small groups and they talked how they could implement those instructional norms in their own classrooms. So the third part of the professional development cycle is tools and planning templates. We have tools that are workshop outlines, observation, self-reflection, implementation tools, a whole variety of them. They are deliberately Microsoft Word and not PDF files because the expectation is that you will download it and then adapt it, make it better, make it fit for your own school or district. We also have some ideas for action, which are kind of small packages of how to pull different stuff from the website and put them together into a professional development package. So together, those three parts of the cycle of professional development can contextualize everything and provide a progress line of the different resources that may be helpful for educators. I will move very, very quickly to planning and evaluation. We have two types of planning and evaluation resources. One is actually what I just mentioned under the Do What Works tab under each practice on the website. There are planners, checklists, and observation tools. And they can be used, for example, to check for quality of implementation. Now, we know that quality of implementation is critically important for the success of the school improvement. So checklists that provide, these are checklists that provide items to know, am I aligned with the key concepts and the key findings that experts over and over again have found across the board in case studies of school turnaround that they have synthesized. And we have compiled all of those into checklists. And we always say the caveat, not everything may be the right or the feasible item for your school, but these are the same things, the same actions that come up over and over again in the research. Now, just as important is providing the support systems and enabling infrastructures, and they are in the form of comprehensive planning templates for the state, district, and the school levels. Here is one way that a State Department of Education has used the website. Last year, we have gathered stories of use, and this we learned from Arizona Department of Education. They have put together a 4 days Turnaround Summer Institute. They had 120 participants who were district superintendents, assistant superintendents, principals, instructional coaches, representatives of federal programs. And they have weaved DWW materials into the entire Summer Institute. One of the small group discussions that happened there were around two tools that you will find under the practice of leadership, and they are the principal self-reflection tool and the needs for school leadership self-assessment tool. And what they have done, they have developed a common understanding of what the items mean and developed a common vocabulary. They have thought about their own action plans and how it can be integrated into their action plans. And then they followed in their own schools and districts by local implementation. If you have any questions, I will be happy to show more and to play some media for you. And you can either download materials and post it on your own website. There are no copyright issues. or ask us for a DVD of materials. So I will hand it over back to Dawn. Thanks.